Hello and welcome to another video trying to get you the very top grades. Today it's going to be a short one. I'm going to teach you from this image, from these quotations, and then finally from these. And at the end of it you're going to understand exactly what Stevenson was up to when he was contrasting the power of good and the power of evil. Well, let's start with the image here. This is when Dr. Lanyon sees Hyde transform into Dr. Jekyll. This is the moment that makes Dr. Lanyon give up on life because he has seen too much, and what he has seen goes against the words of God. Because in his view, Dr. Jekyll has taken the place of God, creating a new life form who is evil. So normally, students look at this and they think, all right, okay, so Jekyll is good and Hyde is evil. Well, the first thing you have to remember is that is not what Stevenson is saying at all. Stevenson is saying that we are all like Dr. Jekyll, and we all have within us the power to be good and the power to be evil. Dr. Jekyll's tragedy is that he creates a new self out of his evil self. He doesn't just remain good, he is still partly good and partly evil, but his evil self is able to behave in totally evil ways. Now, this panders exactly to the contemporary reader who's Christian and is also obsessed with this debate between the goodness of the soul that's going to go to heaven and sinful acts that the evil part of their natures commit, which might take them to hell. But Stevenson is also very subtle because he doesn't really share society's views about good and evil. So in a sense, he's giving them what they want with the story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He's presenting it as a battle between good and evil, but he's actually not sure that's a real battle. And the way to illustrate that is what happens to Dr. Lanyon. Dr. Lanyon effectively gives up on life. He effectively commits suicide. His death is utterly pointless. And that is Stevenson's point. This obsession with good and evil leads us to live very narrow, unfulfilled lives. And in Lanyon's case, it leads him to actually choose death. And so he actually ridicules this idea of good and evil because it leads somebody who is leading a lovely life to just give up on it. In other words, Stevenson is attacking Christianity in this novel at the same time as presenting Christianity in ways that his readers will understand. However, for the more subtle reader, the reader who understands what Stevenson is up to, they'll pick up on this message that he is attacking the idea of Christianity and the whole notion of what is good and what is evil. Well, let's look a bit more closely at how this interpretation comes about. So let's try this quotation. There comes an end to all things. The most capacious measure is filled at last, and this brief condescension to evil finally destroyed the balance of my soul. So this is Jekyll speaking, and he's talking about his time as Hyde as being brief compared to the whole lifespan he's had. But he said creating Hyde has destroyed the balance of my soul. In other words, he is telling the reader that he, Jekyll, is a repenting sinner who realizes he now deserves to die, even though he doesn't want to. And so this allows Dr. Jekyll to face his death. Now, it's a peculiar form of death because when he dies, he actually gets replaced by Hyde. Now, you can see in this image how popular readers of the time would have seen Hyde as just a characterization of evil and therefore this horrible, monstrous sort of figure. But actually in the novel, Hyde isn't described that way at all. He creates a monstrous reaction in people, but he's actually young and lively. He doesn't appear as this kind of figure at all. And this is what Stevenson's getting at. He creates somebody who's simply youthful and able to indulge in all their pleasures. And he's starting to argue that that isn't evil. Well, if that's true, Mr. Salles, why does Jekyll himself use this language of good and evil? Well, It's because his readers are obsessed with what's going to happen to their soul, and they're obsessed with this religious divine battle between good and evil. So he's writing to his readers in language that they'll understand, but hoping to change a few minds on the way. Strange as my circumstances were, the terms of this debate are as old and commonplace as man. Much the same inducements and alarms cast the die for any tempted and trembling sinner, and it fell out with me, as it falls with so vast a majority of my fellows, that I chose the better part, and was found wanting in the strength to keep it. So here he becomes less of a villain, does Dr. Jekyll, and he's saying, look, I'm exactly like the majority. So he's telling his readers, I'm just like you. And like you, I chose the better part, so I chose to be good. And ultimately, that's what he does. He tries to get rid of Hyde, but of course Hyde has become too strong by then. But he chose the better part, but didn't have the strength. He was found wanting in that strength. And what he's saying to his readers there is, look, you are all prone to evil. Now this is another way of saying, don't be so quick to judge people who are evil, because they're just like you. They're just trying to be good, but they give in to evil acts. But he's also being a lot more subtle here, and he's saying, well, you too are full of evil that you're fighting to contain. Because the next part of his argument is going to be, well, if we've all got it and it's all inside us, is it really evil? And I'll explore that a bit later. So in these three quotations, I'm going to show you how Stevenson questions the very idea of evil. Let's have a look. All human beings, as we meet them, are commingled out of good and evil, and Edward Hyde, alone in the ranks of mankind, was pure evil. Well, many Victorian readers would have taken that on face value, and they would have had this kind of image in their mind. However, if we look at what Hyde actually does, he tramples on this girl. If you've watched my video on that, you'll realise that really just knocks her over and keeps on walking. He doesn't trample on her at all. He steps on her with one foot, and the doctor says she's completely unharmed. So he's done absolutely nothing wrong there. This is just a minor accident in the street, and this girl's pelted into him running at full speed. It's not his fault. Well, what else does he do in the novel? He doesn't do anything else that's evil at all, apart from kill Sir Danvers Carew. Now, I admit that's a biggie. However, he's been kept in solitary confinement inside Dr. Jekyll for 12 months when that happens. You know, imagine if you'd been locked up and not allowed any human contact at all for 12 months. You too might appear full of rage and indeed a bit deranged. So we might have some sympathy for what's happened to Hyde and the way he's been treated by Dr. Jekyll. And we certainly can't say that this one murder makes him pure evil. That's not the case at all. And the other thing we can say is it wasn't even premeditated. He didn't set out to find Sir Danvers Carew or indeed any other victim. He was just overcome with the emotion of his situation. And if you've watched my video on homosexuality, you'll see there are other reasons why Hyde might very well want to attack Sir Danvers Carew. Right, now let's look at the words of Dr. Lanyon, who you remember has virtually committed suicide and pointlessly given up on his own life. "Oh God," I screamed, "and oh God again and again, for there, before my eyes, pale and shaken and half fainting and groping before him with his hands like a man restored from death, there stood Henry Jekyll." And so here we have a really interesting idea. Lanyon profoundly believes in God. He represents the Christian reader. He keeps invoking God's name. But what sin does he commit? Well, the sin of giving up on life. Suicide was considered a terrible sin. If you committed suicide, you weren't allowed to be buried in consecrated ground. You weren't allowed to be buried in a church or a churchyard. Now, we don't actually see Lanyon take a poison to kill himself, but let's think about it plausibly. If you give up on life, how easy is it simply to die? I mean, if you just decided now that life was pointless, you'd still be alive in 2 weeks. You know, even if you starved yourself, you'd still be alive in 2 weeks. But we're invited to believe that Dr. Lanyon simply gives up the ghost, as it were, and simply dies. And that's totally implausible. So Stevenson has set up a situation where we, the reader, can infer that Lanyon has committed suicide and has therefore gone against the judgment of God. And even if we accept that he's just given up, he's still committing suicide, even if he actually doesn't take a poison to do it. And when Stevenson sets that up, he's ridiculing the idea of religion here and Christianity. Now, once we have this idea that Stevenson's ridiculing the idea of Christianity, let's look at this quotation. "Oh, my poor old Harry Jekyll, if ever I read Satan's signature upon a face, it is on that of your new friend." And, you know, this is an extraordinary thing, isn't it? This is right at the beginning of the novel when Utterson has first met Hyde, and all he's done is looked at him, and he's decided just on his face that Hyde must be so evil that Satan has actually written on his face, you know, that his evil is so pronounced you can read Satan's mark on him. Now, that is utterly absurd, as any pause for thought will let you think Hyde hasn't done anything. And we can't look at someone's face and instantly see that they're completely evil or completely innocent. It's impossible to do. And in fact, that's the whole point of the description of Jekyll as a handsome man, a respectable figure. But he's actually called handsome because Stevenson is suggesting that we're all made up of good and evil. So what then is Stevenson's real message about good and evil? Well, what he's saying is the ideas of good and evil are in effect a social and religious construct. They're not real for all time. You know, different societies in different times would have totally different ideas about what good and evil are. And what he's suggesting is that our society, I'm speaking as Stevenson, our society has got it wrong. What would Dr. Jekyll's life be like if he were able to indulge in whatever it is that Hyde is up to? So before Hyde is imprisoned inside Jekyll for 12 months, he goes off and he doesn't appear to commit any crimes. The police are never involved. And Stevenson doesn't even tell us the source of acts that he's up to. Well, they're probably sexual. Now, why shouldn't somebody be able to just indulge their sexual passions as long as they can find a partner who's willing to do the same thing? Now, when we look at it that way, the tragedy of Dr. Jekyll isn't that he commits evil acts, is that he wants to pursue simple pleasures, but society treats those pleasures as evil, and therefore he has to create this alter ego in order to indulge them and not face the ruin of scandal and the reputation that society would criticise him with. And then the irony of the book is that the only main character left standing is Utterson, who is the most boring kind of man we could possibly imagine. Let's remind ourselves of the very beginning of the novel. Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, was a man of a rugged countenance, so far so good, that was never lighted by a smile. He never smiles, he's never happy. He's cold, scanty, and embarrassed in discourse. He doesn't even communicate with people properly. He's backward in sentiment. He doesn't reveal his feelings. He obviously doesn't care about the feelings of others. He's lean and long, so he doesn't indulge in any food that he loves. He doesn't get fat at all. He is dusty, so he doesn't really pay much attention to his appearance. He's dreary. He's boring. You wouldn't want to talk to him, and yet somehow lovable. Now that is really, really ironic, because what Stevenson's doing here is saying, look, if this is the last man left standing, then that is the kind of man our society is creating. Do you, dear reader, do you want to live in a society that creates this as the thing that survives? Or do you want to create a society in which somebody like Dr. Jekyll can thrive and simply be himself and not have to resort to secret and possibly illegal means to gain his pleasures? So when we look at the novel like this, we can start to read it as partly a satire, attacking the very readers who love it. So he's undermining their expectations of what Christian ideas, Christian notions of good and evil really are. He speaks to them in the language of Christianity, and he talks about good and evil so that they can see it as a simple battle between right and wrong, good and bad, heaven and hell. But actually, when we get to the end of the novel and think about it more deeply, he's questioning that and saying, well, was Hyde ever really evil? And what would have happened if Jekyll could have done as he pleased? And is the Christian reaction to this development of science and to this transformation that Jekyll has created, is that reasonable to simply give up on life? And indeed, if there is a God, would he forgive such an act? So very profound questions that Stevenson is asking of his readers. And once you start dealing with those interpretations, you are automatically at the top of the mark scheme. So as usual, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more videos taking you to the very top grades, and see you soon on my channel.